The humid, oppressive air of the mangrove swamps hung heavy, a suffocating blanket of moisture and decay. The labyrinthine network of roots, the murky, stagnant waters, and the dense, impenetrable vegetation created a world of shadows, a place where secrets could be buried and horrors concealed. Within this sinister realm, a predator stalked his prey, a man whose name became synonymous with terror. Daniel Camargo Barbosa, the Mangrove Monster. Daniel Camargo Barbosa's life was a descent into the abyss, a journey marked by a relentless progression of violence and a chilling disregard for human life. Born in Colombia, his early years were characterized by instability and a pervasive sense of alienation. He drifted through life, a shadowy figure on the fringes of society, his path littered with petty crimes that gradually escalated into acts of unspeakable brutality. By the 1970s, Camargo had transformed into a specter of fear, his presence a harbinger of dread, particularly for the vulnerable women and young girls who were unfortunate enough to cross his path. His hunting grounds were the isolated coastal regions of Ecuador and Colombia, where the dense mangrove swamps provided the perfect cover for his heinous acts. His modus operandi was a chilling testament to his methodical and sadistic nature. He preyed on the most vulnerable, often targeting women, and made it unlikely that anyone would hear their cries for help. The mangroves became his personal domain, a place where he could indulge his darkest desires with impunity. The tangled roots and stagnant waters concealed his crimes, making it nearly impossible to trace his victims. The sheer difficulty of navigating the swamps hindered law enforcement efforts, allowing Camargo to operate in a terrifyingly unchecked manner. He understood the terrain and used it to his advantage. The accounts of those who survived his attacks, though few, paint a vivid picture of a man driven by a savage and insatiable hunger for violence. He was described as cold, calculating, and utterly devoid of empathy. He reveled in the terror he inflicted, the power he held over his victims. He was a hunter who derived pleasure from the act of destruction. His victims described a man who seemed to enjoy the fear in their eyes. The true scale of Camargo's crimes may never be fully known. While official figures suggest dozens of victims, many believe the actual number is far higher, perhaps reaching into the hundreds. The remote locations of his crimes, the social vulnerability of his victims, and the limitations of law enforcement in the regions he frequented all contributed to the difficulty in establishing an accurate count. The lack of detailed record-keeping in the areas he operated and the general lack of resources hindered the ability of authorities to effectively investigate. The investigation into Camargo's crimes was a long and arduous process. The lack of witnesses, the challenges of recovering bodies from the mangroves, and the vastness of his hunting grounds presented formidable obstacles. However, through persistent police work and the courageous testimony of survivors, a horrifying picture began to emerge. The police were forced to learn to navigate the difficult terrain of the mangroves and to develop new techniques for searching and recovering bodies. The discovery of bodies within the mangroves provided crucial evidence, linking the disappearances and confirming Camargo's involvement. The growing awareness of his crimes ignited fear and outrage within the communities he terrorized. The name Mangrove Monster spread like wildfire, a chilling epithet that captured the essence of his brutality and the environment in which he thrived. The communities he terrorized were left with a deep-seated fear of the mangroves, a fear that persists to this day. Camargo's capture was a story of its own. He was eventually apprehended in Ecuador in 1986, following a series of attacks that left a trail of terror. During his imprisonment, he confessed to the murders of over 70 women and girls. However, his confessions were often inconsistent, leaving many to believe that the true number of his victims was far greater. He often changed details or recanted his statements, making it difficult to determine the truth. His time in prison was marked by turmoil and escapes, each one triggering a renewed wave of fear and manhunts. He was finally recaptured and remained incarcerated until his death in 1994, reportedly at the hands of a fellow inmate. Even in prison, he remained a figure of fear, and his fellow inmates saw him as a monster. The legacy of Daniel Camargo Barbosa is a dark stain on humanity. He represents the depths of human depravity, a chilling reminder of the evil that can lurk in the shadows. His crimes left deep scars on the communities he terrorized, wounds that continue to linger. The psychological trauma he inflicted extended far beyond the immediate victims. The fear and anxiety he generated permeated entire communities, leaving a lasting impact on the collective psyche. The story of the Mangrove Monster serves as a stark warning about the importance of vigilance and the need to protect the most vulnerable among us. It highlights the challenges faced by law enforcement in remote and challenging environments and the enduring impact of violent crime on individuals and communities. The lack of resources and the difficulty of operating in remote locations are issues that continue to plague law enforcement in many parts of the world. To truly understand the horror of Camargo's actions, we must consider the societal context in which he operated. The poverty and marginalization of the communities he targeted made his victims particularly vulnerable. The lack of resources and support systems meant that many victims were never reported missing, and their cases were never properly investigated. The social stigma associated with sexual violence also contributed to the underreporting of his crimes. The psychological impact of Camargo's crimes was devastating. The survivors of his attacks were left with deep emotional scars, struggling with trauma, fear, and a profound sense of vulnerability. The families of his victims were left with a lifetime of grief and unanswered questions. The communities he terrorized were left with a deep-seated fear of the mangroves, a fear that continues to haunt them. Even now, years later, the name Daniel Camargo Barbosa can bring up feelings of dread. And it should. We should remember the victims, and we should remember the evil that he brought to the world. And we should use that memory to strengthen our resolve to fight against such evil in the future. We must work to create a society where the most vulnerable are protected and where the perpetrators of violence are held accountable. Beyond the immediate terror and the tangible losses, Camargo's actions eroded the very fabric of trust within the communities he ravaged. The sense of safety, the unspoken understanding that neighbors would look out for one another, was shattered. The mangroves, once a part of their daily lives, became a symbol of dread, a place where the innocent vanished. Children were warned to stay away, and the simple act of venturing near the water's edge became fraught with anxiety. This pervasive fear had a ripple effect, impacting economic activity, social interactions, and the overall well-being of the region. Fishermen who relied on the mangroves for their livelihood found themselves hesitant to venture into familiar waters. Women who traditionally gathered shellfish or washed clothes in the rivers lived in constant fear. The once vibrant communities intertwined with the ecosystem became shadows of their former selves, haunted by the specter of the Mangrove Monster. The social isolation that resulted from the fear served to further isolate the most vulnerable in the communities, making them even more at risk. In the silent, humid mangroves, the echoes of his crimes may have faded, but the memory of Daniel Camargo Barbosa, the Mangrove Monster, continues to haunt our collective consciousness, a chilling testament to the darkness that once thrived in the shadows, and a reminder of the ever-present need for vigilance against evil.